Welcome to the Chapter 5 companion video for sound classes and audio volumes. Most likely this video will be broken up into a couple of different parts, so make sure that if you're watching this one that you look for the other parts associated with it. And this video is part 1 in the series for Chapter 5. I do want to make note that I am not going to be going over the new sound cue nodes for this chapter. You've been working with sound cue nodes enough this semester that you should be able to figure out how to use them on your own without me stepping you through them. They're all very important, so make sure that you are implementing them, since implementation of some of these nodes is important to complete the assignment correctly. The especially important one is setting up an attenuation node on your sounds. So we will be working kind of down through this, and I'm going to start off with talking about sound classes. Now that we're getting a little bit more complex, you most likely will need to implement your own sound classes into your game. In fact, in order to get reverbs and occlusion working, you need to use sound classes to do that. So if for some reason you're finding your reverb's not working or your audio occlusion's not working, make sure you went and made your own sound class and set your sounds to the sound class, or else it's not going to work correctly. So what is a sound class? Sound classes are used in the Unreal Engine to give overall settings to groups of sounds. So that, for instance, if you have UI sound effects, you would have a UI sound class, and you can give specific settings to those. If you have in-game sound effects, you'd have your own sound class for that. Dialogue could have its own sound classes, and you can even have a master sound class and have sub-sound classes of those. By default, Unreal does have some sound classes in them already. So like if we go ahead and locate the sound effect for the gun shooting, underneath here we see you have class, and it's using the master sound class. And it has a couple of sound classes in there by default, like master music, normal, sound effects, special attack, and voice. But if we double click here, we can go to the master sound class. You're not really supposed to manipulate any of the settings in here, since these are kind of used by a lot of things. So if you want to make your own, if you need to make changes to it, you're going to need to make your own sound class. And we can do that by same way that we've been making any other kind of asset. So let me make a new folder real quick, which I already have one, sorry about that, called sound effects. And I'm going to make a new sound class in here for me. And make sure you're following along with this, because you're going to need this sound class in order for some of the stuff later on to work. So I'm going to go right click, sounds, and classes. Down here I'm going to choose sound class, and I'm just going to give this a boring name and call it my sound class, so that I can set some settings to this. It is a node-based system. There's a couple things we do need to check on for this in order for some stuff to get to work later, but I'll kind of explain a little bit about this too. But make sure that reverb is checked on, and make sure apply ambient volumes is also checked on. If you ever did need to do an overall adjustment to sounds associated with the sound class, you could do that. For instance, if you're finding that all of the sound effects, like if this was like the UI sound class, all your UI sounds were way too loud or way too quiet, you could come in and change the volume. And this would change the volume on every single sound associated with that class. You could raise and lower the pitch. You can do a lot of fun, interesting things. But for us, we just need to make sure that the reverb is checked on, so that when we set up our reverb volumes, they will work. And you need to make sure apply ambient volumes is turned on as well, so that we can get the occlusion to work. And I think you might need this checked on to also get the reverb. I can't quite remember, but it's just important that if you're going to be using the audio volumes, have these two checked on. And we're going to click save, and we should be good to go. We can now start assigning the sound class to our sounds. So the next thing I'm going to show is reverb. But in order to get the reverb to work, we need to make sure that our gun sound effect is set to the sound class, because by default, if remember you saw that it was set to that master sound class, we need to make sure that we're setting the sound class associated with our gun sound to the my sound class. And any other sound that you create when you create your sound cues for your projects, make sure you're setting them equal to the my sound class or whatever your sound class that you created for that. So let's go and find that gun sound again. I'm just going to do a sounds filter. It's the easiest way to find it. I'm just going to double click it. And rather than the master sound class, we're going to change this to my sound class and save it. And now it'll work. Let's say that we are making our own sound cue and we want to make sure that it's working with our sound class. All you do is create a sound cue just like before. And I'm just going to say let's pretend this was called outside ambient. And it's meant to go outside this environment and be set up. When you go in to edit it, the class is right here on the left. We've never really talked about it before. And it's just right here. And you just need to make sure that you're changing it from master to whatever sound class that you need and save it. And I think let's see. Let me make sure that, let's see how we can get back to it. Let's say we have because if you select the looping node, it disappears, but I believe you just have to click on the output. Yeah, just click on the output and you can change the class in there. So sound class is pretty easy, but it's an important thing. You need to make sure that you're setting those up. For this example, I'm just working in the project for this week. And at the end of all the videos, I'm going to explain the project a little bit better. But if you're wondering where I'm working, it's just in there. So a little bit about the environment. If we hit play, you start off in that holodeck sort of area in here, and you enter into this bank vault that's been kind of ransacked. The whole kind of theme of this level is it's kind of a war zone sort of environment. So you're going to have a lot of interesting ambient kind of going on in here. And if we go up that ramp, we have this back room that's kind of like a bank back room. And if we go out, we have a long street that we can walk down with some interesting objects. And I'll get to those objects later. But you can go all the way down, and then there's a building on the other end that you can that you're going to be needing for some other things. But for reverb, I'm just going to focus on this bank building and the outside a little bit. So the sound that we're going to be using is going to test out the reverb is going to be the gunfire. So I'm just going to shoot this gun. So prepare for the noise. And you can hear what it sounds like. It's just kind of like that generic sort of sound. And we are going to add some reverb to this now. So what is reverb? Reverb is one of those sound effects that you don't really notice it unless it's not there or it's implemented incorrectly. The best way to kind of describe it is it's those tiny little echoes that you hear at the end of sounds that is affected by the type of environment that you're in. So for instance, most likely my sound has a little bit of reverb on this video. Since the room I'm recording it in doesn't have a lot of soft surfaces, so it's kind of reflecting back off the wall and giving a little bit of that echo on it. And you can hear it really extreme if you ever go into an auditorium and you start talking and you almost hear an actual echo going on. And if you were to walk in a large room like that and not hear the reverb, it would feel really strange. You might not quite be able to figure out right away what's wrong with the environment, but it would seem really off. And the opposite, if you've ever actually walked into a room that's meant to not have echo, I don't know if anyone's ever been into an audio recording booth where they have the sound fabric on the wall that's meant to absorb sound. It's really strange to be in an environment that doesn't have any reverb. But you know, there's places in the world that wouldn't have it. But the whole point is that we need to set up reverb in our environments for our sounds that has a realistic feel to it. And that means that we don't really want any gaps in our reverb. So we're going to be setting up our reverb volumes really efficiently and to make sure that we don't have any gaps in them either. And we set this up with using volumes. So we're going to define a space with an audio volume and set some reverb, and then we'll work into smaller spaces and set more specific reverb. It's a good workflow to kind of have an overall default reverb volume so that if your specific reverbs end up having little bits of gaps in them, you don't accidentally have space that has absolutely no reverb, because that would be really strange. So for instance, I'm going to set up a larger default reverb that takes up like the street and that room that I'm working in. And we create reverb volumes with audio volumes. And you find those underneath the volumes tab over here on the left. And it's the first one on the list, the audio volume one. And we're just going to drag and drop it sort of where we want to start working. I do want to make sure that I'm taking up the street and that building. So I'm going to adjust the size, and you can be a little bit sloppy with this. In fact, it's better to be a little bit sloppy because you don't, like I said, you don't want to have any gaps by accident. And let me find settings for this. So let's scale this. Actually, no, we shouldn't be scaling it. Let's change the brush size. Sorry about that. Let's make this bigger. And we want to make sure that it's not that big. Sorry. We want to make sure it's big enough that we can't accidentally walk out of it. And we want to make sure that's tall enough that we can't accidentally jump out of it either. So we're going to make this kind of big. And let's take up the whole street. It's a little bit too big. Let's bring that back some and slide it down. So that's looking pretty good, maybe a little bit longer. And let's see, it goes all the way into the basement, so we should be good to go with this. We should make sure that we name this, and I'm going to name this reverb exterior or outside or something like that to make sure that I know that that's what it is. The nice thing about audio volumes is if you sort your world outliner by type, it does appear at the top since it starts with an A. So if you need to find it real easily, you should be trying to keep your world outliner a little bit more neat. It's up here at the top. So a couple settings. You need to make sure that your audio volume is enabled. We'll get to priority in a minute because that's important, but we'll get to that in a minute. And we need to make sure that our reverb is on. Apply reverb is on. So before it works, because if we hit play, it's still not going to work, we need to make sure that we're giving it a reverb effect. And if we click the drop down, I have them. You most likely do not have them. And that's because you need to make sure that you're looking at the correct thing. If this is empty, that's okay. I'm going to show you how to turn them on. Just never try to create your own reverb. If you're interested in that stuff, that's great. But for this course, just use the defaults with this. We're not going to learn how to make our own. It's outside the scope of this course. So just do the defaults. So what do you do if you don't see these here? It's just that we need to turn them on. And we can do that either by clicking here, or if that's not quite open, you just want to turn it on overall, you can click right here. It's just wherever this eyeball and view options is. And you need to make sure that show engine content is enabled. I had already enabled mine, that's why it shows, but if I disable it, I don't have that. So if you don't see your reverb effects, go to view options and show engine content, and you'll see all of them. So I'm going to choose one that is very obvious, like that auditorium. So now if I hit play, it's not quite working. Hold on. Let me make sure. Sorry if there was a little blip in the recording. I paused it and figured out what I missed to get the reverb working. There's a setting I forgot to set in the my sound class. So if you go back to the sound class, you need to change the default 2D Reverb Send to, I put it on 1, and then it makes it a lot more obvious that it's working. So make sure that in your sound class you have reverb turned on, the default 2D Reverb Send set to 1, and the apply ambient volumes checked on, and save that. We should then be able to hear it now when we hit play. So if I actually, let's see, what did I set it to? I have my effect set to Stone Room. So now if I hit play and fire, if you're wearing headphones, you should be able to hear it. If you're not wearing headphones, most likely it's not very easy to hear. You could always raise the volume on that too. Let me change it to maybe like the auditorium. Again, hit play. Now you should really hear that, even if you aren't wearing headphones. So, you know, we don't really want it to sound like that. That's a little bit too much. So let me take that volume back down to 0.5. But sometimes you need to do extreme to know that it's working, because it is a really subtle effect. So let's see what that sounds like. It's a little bit better. If that's still a little bit too much for you, we could always affect that 2D Reverb Send. And let's try it at 0.5 and see what that sounds like. And that's starting to be a little bit better. So mess around with the settings. You know, it's something that should be subtle. And like this would not, even if we're outside, it shouldn't sound like that. That really doesn't fit. So let's see if we can find a better, maybe like the city one. That might sound a little bit more realistic. So let's see. Might be a little bit better. So let's hop up into here. I might make it a little bit less. It's a little bit strong. In the sound class, let's try again. It's a little bit better. So now, if we're out here, we're getting a little bit of a reverb. That sounds like a bigger open area. So once we have our overall set, we need to kind of start working our way down. And we need to make sure that we make smaller reverbs for our smaller areas, since our interiors shouldn't sound like, small rooms shouldn't sound like big open areas. So one change I did make when I was pausing it is I did give a priority to my reverb exterior volume. And for that, I gave it a priority of 1. 1 would be the lowest priority. And this goes by the higher the number, the higher the priority, the more that the engine will listen to that one. So if priority of 1 versus like a priority of 5, it's going to look at the reverb volume that has a priority of 5. Think about it like a stack of cookies. Is a person going to want 1 cookie or 5 cookies? They're going to choose the 5 cookies over the 1 cookie. So the higher the number, the more cookies that it's set to, the more that the engine's going to choose that over another one. So let's set an interior one for the overall building. So I'm going to make a new audio volume, and I'm going to name it Reverb Bank Main. And this is going to be nested inside of this larger one, since that's our default one. But I want it to take up both floors, both spaces, since this area up here and this area down here is probably going to sound kind of similar, but we don't really want to have any gaps in it. So it just works a little bit better to shape these so that you make sure that you have overlaps. So let me set this, make it take up the whole room. but we don't want it to go outside of it. So let's kind of right about there. And well, I kind of want to make sure it gets that bottom room down there too. So let's make it a little bit wider. Let's see, right about there, that should be good. And it covers the whole back area. And now let's make it tall enough to take up both. So the default reverb exterior is a priority of 1. So I'm going to set this to have a priority of 2. I'm going to make sure that my thing is enabled and this is enabled, and I'm going to give it an effect of a large room. That should work pretty well. So let's hit play. Let's see, maybe not a large room, it kind of sounds sort of similar. Let's give it a medium room effect. So let's go to bank main. There we go. Let me go up here, and we go out into here, and we have a different effect. And let's actually do it this way. I want that bank main to not be so loud. So let me take this down to like a 0.1 for the volume and try that again. Yeah, I think there's a much better difference now. So it's a lot more echoey up here. Then we walk back in. And it's not. So we would say that these are now nested. And since the one on the inside has the higher priority, if we're in both of them, it takes that one into, it does that one rather than the big one. We would want to go ahead and do some probably more exact ones. This one would probably have a different type of volume since it's a little bit smaller. And we could even do a different one for our holodeck in here, since that might sound even more different. But this should be enough to get you started with that. So I'm going to end part 1 here, and in part 2 we're going to go over how to set up occluding sounds.